Incoming American President Donald Trump has often made headlines with his unconventional and sometimes controversial comments, and his reported quip about paying off the U.S. national debt using cryptocurrency fits into that pattern. While likely intended as a joke, the statement has sparked a mix of curiosity and humor across financial and political circles. However, he's not the first head of state to think of this. Two countries had already made Bitcoin legal tender. The Central African Republic briefly made global headlines in April 2022 when it became the second country in the world to adopt Bitcoin as legal tender, following El Salvador's lead. However, within a year, the ambitious experiment failed, with the government repealing the legislation in March 2023. While the failure of Bitcoin adoption was tied to the country's economic challenges and lack of infrastructure, the roots of the Central African Republic poverty run much deeper, intertwined with its turbulent history of leadership, particularly under Jean-Bedel Bokassa, the self-styled emperor whose extravagant rule drained the nation's resources. To understand why the Central African Republic Bitcoin initiative faltered and why the country remains one of the poorest in the world, we must delve into the legacy of Jean-Bedel Bokassa, whose authoritarian reign epitomized mismanagement, corruption, and squandered potential. Jean-Bedel Bokassa was born on February 22, 1921, in Bangui, Moyen Congo, French Equatorial Africa, now Central African Republic. He was an African military leader who was president of the Central African Republic from 1966 to 76 and self-styled emperor of the Central African Empire from 1976 to 79. The son of a village headman, Bokassa attended local mission schools before joining the French army in 1939. He distinguished himself in the French conflict in Indochina, and by 1961 he had achieved the rank of captain. At the request of President David Dacko, Bokassa left the French armed forces to head the army of the newly independent Central African Republic. On December 31, 1965, Bokassa used his position as supreme military commander to overthrow Dacko. He declared himself president of the republic on January 1, 1966. Jean-Bedel Bokassa rose to power in 1966 through a coup, overthrowing President David Dacko. Initially, Bokassa sought to modernize the Central African Republic with ambitious reforms aimed at economic development. Under his Operation Bokassa, he nationalized industries and attempted to create vast farms and enterprises. However, the initiative was poorly executed, plagued by inefficiency, corruption, and a lack of planning. Instead of fostering development, these projects deepened the country's economic woes. Bokassa's autocratic tendencies soon overshadowed his early reformist vision. By 1976, he declared himself Emperor Bokassa I and transformed the Central African Republic into the Central African Empire, bankrupting the nation to fund a lavish coronation inspired by his idol, Napoleon Bonaparte. The ceremony cost over $20 million, a staggering sum for one of the world's poorest nations, and left the treasury empty. While the population suffered from poverty and underdevelopment, Bokassa's extravagant lifestyle and unpredictable policies worsened the country's financial state. The situation reached its nadir in 1979, when Bokassa's regime was implicated in the massacre of over 100 schoolchildren protesting the requirement to buy uniforms from a company he owned. This incident, coupled with his oppressive rule, led to a French-led coup that deposed him and reinstated Dacko as president. Bokassa went into exile, first traveling to Côte d'Ivoire, but later settling in France. Bokassa was sentenced in absentia to death in 1980, but he inexplicably chose to return to the Central African Republic in 1986. He was arrested and put on trial, and in 1987, he was found guilty of the murders of the school children and other crimes, although he was acquitted of charges of cannibalism. His death sentence was subsequently commuted, and he was freed in 1993. He was posthumously pardoned in 2010 in conjunction with the country's 50th anniversary celebration. By the time Bokassa was overthrown, the Central African Republic was in economic ruin, a condition that has persisted to this day. Bokassa's reign left the Central African Republic deeply scarred. His years in power were marked by the systematic erosion of state institutions, corruption, and a focus on personal enrichment over national development. This legacy of weak governance and instability has persisted, with successive governments struggling to address the foundational challenges of the Central African Republic. Economic fragility. The Central African Republic's economy remains heavily dependent on subsistence agriculture and resource extraction, with little diversification or industrialization. Mismanagement of resources, a hallmark of Bokassa's rule, continues to undermine progress. The Central African Republic has faced repeated coups, armed conflicts, and weak leadership since independence in 1960. This instability discourages foreign investment and prevents the development of critical infrastructure. Infrastructural deficits. The Central African Republic ranks among the lowest in the world for access to electricity, healthcare, and education. Bokassa's squandering of national resources on vanity projects like his coronation exacerbated these issues, leaving the nation unprepared for future challenges. Why Bitcoin failed in the Central African Republic. Given the Central African Republic's historical struggles with governance and development, the adoption of Bitcoin as legal tender in 2022 seemed like a long shot. While proponents argued that Bitcoin could help bank the unbanked and drive economic growth, the initiative faced insurmountable challenges rooted in the country's dire circumstances. Lack of infrastructure. With only 10% of the population having internet access and 85% lacking electricity, the basic requirements for cryptocurrency adoption were absent. The digital currency's potential could not overcome these structural barriers. Skepticism and mistrust by international organizations like the United Nations and the Economic and Monetary Community of Central Africa also raised concerns about the risks of Bitcoin adoption. Domestically, the government's motives were questioned, particularly given its close ties with Russia and speculation about using cryptocurrency to bypass sanctions. Failure to deliver promised benefits. Grandiose plans, such as the creation of a Bitcoin city, never materialized. The promised economic benefits failed to reach ordinary citizens, reinforcing the population's skepticism. The Central African Republic's foray into Bitcoin highlights a recurring theme in its history: ambitious projects undermined by a lack of preparation, infrastructure, and governance. From Bokassa's ill-fated nationalization plans to the failed cryptocurrency experiment, the country has repeatedly pursued initiatives without addressing its foundational issues. Today, the Central African Republic remains mired in poverty, with 79% of its population living below the poverty line and more than 3 million people requiring humanitarian assistance. The enduring effects of mismanagement during Bokassa's rule and the broader challenges of political instability and underdevelopment have left the nation ill-equipped to embrace modern innovations like Bitcoin.